This story is about 26-year-old Elle Edwards. On Christmas Eve 2022, she was celebrating with her friends in a pub in Ali Village, Liverpool, UK. The gal was real vibrant and beautiful. She worked as a cosmetologist in a local beauty salon and was also an assistant to a dermatologist. Elle was naturally positive and mighty kind, which allowed her to win over even the most demanding clients. Elle was pretty and had become an excellent specialist in her field. The gal was cheerful and always smiling, but at the same time, she remained determined, constantly moving towards her goals and dreams. On December 24, 2022, her sister Lucy flew in from Dubai to spend the holidays with the family, and Elle eagerly awaited her return. They decided to celebrate this long-awaited event in style. So the girls and their friends headed to the local pub. Here they had a great time, laughing a lot, dancing and singing karaoke. In the merry atmosphere, no one noticed that a person to whom kindness was alien was nearby. Around 11:50 p.m., an emergency call came in. As they were exiting the pub, no less than 12 shots were fired, and 2 of them hit Elle. She suffered a gunshot wound to the head that proved to be mighty serious. The dispatcher directed emergency services to the scene. They urgently arrived at the pub, loaded the gal into an ambulance, and took her to the local hospital. However, she died on the way, as her injuries were incompatible with life. When the police informed the victim's family about the tragedy, they were in a state of shock. No one believed it, and no one understood how this could have happened to her. No one suspected that this beautiful and cheerful girl could have had deadly enemies. In the early stages of the investigation, the detectives had no leads. The assailant had attacked unexpectedly and disappeared mysteriously, leaving only a shell casing and the bleeding victim at the crime scene. The attack was sudden but well-planned and gave Elle no chance of survival. But was the gal the true target of the attack, or did she become a random victim of a madman? An unknown car stopped near the pub entrance, and minutes later the shooting started. In addition to the deceased, 4 other men received gunshot wounds of varying severity. All of them were young people aged 22 to 33 who were spending the evening in the establishment and lived in nearby towns. Initially, police were inclined to believe that the murdered woman was a random victim. It was known that criminal gangs were operating in the area periodically. The shooting was likely a routine showdown between their members. However, all of this was just conjecture, which would have to be proven or disproved in the course of the investigation. So the detectives delved deeper into the victim's personality and the witnesses to the crime. The victim's relatives were at a loss as to who could have wanted Elle's death, as the girl seemed to have no ill-wishers or enemies capable of such horrors. The detectives decided to interview other witnesses and the victims of the unknown criminal's gunfire. In addition, law enforcement officers requested the pub owner's video surveillance recordings. It would be necessary to talk to dozens of people and analyze several hours of video recordings. Several police officers were working on the extensive investigation. It was necessary to answer several difficult questions. There were too many victims of the attack. But was this spontaneous aggression, or did the perpetrator pursue a specific target? All witnesses to the incident were interrogated. However, checking mobile communications data took more time. The media were notified to assist in the investigation. Law enforcement officers urged anyone with valuable information to come to the police station. First and foremost, this concerned possible video recordings made by random eyewitnesses, on any of which the car in which the aggressor arrived might appear. After the crime, the police held a meeting with local residents. The purpose of this communication was to persuade people possessing valuable information to share it with law enforcement officers. It was assumed that someone might have seen the moment of the attack or known the criminal. People were urged not to be afraid of the criminals and the local feuding clans. Community leaders supported local residents during this difficult time. In addition to the conversations, activists went door to door and communicated with the neighbors. Specially trained officers worked with the family of the deceased. They began to provide them with support in connection with the heavy loss. In the course of this work, it was established that the perpetrator had left the pub parking lot in a dark-colored car. Eyewitness accounts regarding it may differed. It was dark and it was difficult to make out anything, but the most likely was a dark Mercedes-Benz. Later, this was confirmed after checking the outdoor surveillance cameras. The killer did not immediately open fire. He drove up to the parking lot and observed the pub visitors for some time. He sat in the car so that he could freely see the entrance and most of what was happening inside. Apparently, he was choosing the most convenient moment for the attack. After a few minutes of surveillance, when Elle came out, the criminal quickly got out of the car, fired 12 shots, then instantly got back behind the wheel and disappeared. Investigators, after studying the recordings, made an important conclusion. The attacker was alone. No one helped him. It was not possible to trace the exact location where the perpetrator fled. Therefore, the detectives went door to all local residents, describing the car and recounting the circumstances of the incident, trying to establish the identity of the killer. Patrolling the streets was carried out around the clock, and this yielded results. Just 2 days after the shooting, detectives detained 2 suspects, but no names were mentioned until all the circumstances were clarified. However, it was not possible to prove their involvement in the crime, in particular because the murder weapon was not found. After that, the detectives made a statement to the public, saying that they would not rest until the unknown shooter was punished. All this was intended to calm the local residents, who were outraged by the rampant crime and the powerlessness of the authorities. It was also assumed that the attack had been provoked by a feud between local gangs. In this case, Elle would be considered a random victim. However, all this was also just an assumption that remained to be verified. In the course of the investigation, it was possible to establish that the potential targets could have been Jake Duffy and Kieran Sokold, members of the local Beechwood gang, who were spending the evening in the pub. It became known that they had been in a long-term, fierce conflict with another group claiming this territory. On December 29th, the police arrested another person, but he was not the one who opened fire. The suspect had a solid alibi that excluded him from the list of suspects. However, the detectives suspected that he had participated in the setup for the attack. Around the same time, the dark Mercedes car in which the killer had left the pub parking lot was identified. But due to the lack of direct evidence, the name of the third suspect was also not disclosed. There were some difficulties with the found car. The car was traced through video surveillance systems and identified thanks to the cameras. But law enforcement officers were too late. On December 31st, the police department received a report that a fire had started near the scene of the shooting. When the special services arrived at the scene, they found a dark Mercedes similar to the perpetrator's vehicle, which was engulfed in flames. The vehicle was completely burned out. Valuable evidence was lost in the flames. The perpetrators clearly knew that the police were on their trail, so they decided to destroy one of the direct pieces of evidence, despite the fact that the fire did not completely destroy the car. It was confirmed that it had been used during the shooting. However, the Mercedes did not belong to the perpetrators but had been stolen shortly before the attack. Presumably, the arson was committed intentionally to complicate the investigation after the murder of competitors. On January 11th, 2 more suspects, a 22-year-old man and a 23-year-old woman, were delivered to the police department. They were arrested in Central Wales. The man's name was Connor Chapman. He was well known to the police. He had an extensive criminal record that he had accumulated over the past 5 years before the murder of Elle Edwards. Connor had started with daring lawbreakings and gradually sank deeper into the abyss of crime. One of his first serious crimes was a car theft under aggravating circumstances. He had repeatedly become a suspect in robberies, hooliganism, and threatening behavior. Once the young man was involved in a chase with the police, after which he abandoned the car and hid in the bushes nearby. When they detained him, the criminal said that he did not understand what chase they were talking about and that he was there just waiting for a friend. In this case, he became the real star. The detainee's data ended up in newspaper headlines. Connor Chapman was from Birkenhead, Liverpool. His parents had left him at an early age, so his grandparents had formalized guardianship. It was in their house that the hero of the story moved. The teenager dropped out of high school shortly before the exams. In general, he studied poorly and no special hopes were pinned on him. He was always considered a problem child. The young hooligan first became a defendant in a court case in 2014 when he was 14 years old. Connor was accused of shoplifting. As early as 2016, he committed another crime. His involvement in the theft of a car was proven when the young man was detained in a stolen vehicle. He did not have a driver's license or insurance, which was a violation of the terms of his suspended sentence. In 2017, high theft was added to the storage of prohibited substances. During this period, he was also under police supervision, so he had again violated the restraining order. As a result, he was banned from accessing several parts of the city. Connor was not allowed to appear in public places, as he clearly posed a threat to society. However, as early as 2019, he violated the ban again. The patrol detained him in a public place. The young man had a knife and prohibited substances with him. In the same year, the general public first heard about Connor Chapman. He appeared on the pages of the local newspaper after an unsuccessful attempt to escape from the police in a stolen car. The city patrol noticed a stolen Audi on the streets and ordered the driver to stop and get out of the car with his hands up. However, the 18-year-old Chapman did not obey, provoking a chase. During the short flight, Connor committed a large number of traffic violations. In particular, he accelerated to more than 80 kilometers per hour in areas with a 30 kilometers limit. He repeatedly drove into oncoming traffic and in the end crashed into the curb. At speed, the car was thrown aside and turned around. The driver could not continue the journey, so he got out of the car and ran away. However, even here he was unlucky, as the patrol caught up with him in the bushes just a few hundred meters away. In his defense, the young man said that he was waiting there for a friend. But the deception was obvious. Connor's lawyer explained in court that his client had fallen under the influence of a bad company. The court found him guilty of the need to release the budding criminal. He was found to have attention deficit disorder and a number of other disorders identified by private specialists during the trial. Despite this, due to numerous violations and potentially dangerous behavior on the road, he was sentenced to a term of up to 8 months in prison for 2 months. The young man also received a ban on driving a car, which was in effect after his release. Thus, the budding criminal had achieved 14 convictions for 30 criminal episodes by the time he reached adulthood. It was obvious that he had no intention of changing and categorically refused to fit into society. Everyone understood that he was potentially dangerous, but legal grounds for isolating him from society had not been found. This was due to the fact that so far no person had been seriously injured by his inadequate behavior. The public was outraged by the powerlessness of the authorities. Everything was shaping up so that the criminal elements could do nothing until they killed or maimed innocent people. And that's how it turned out. In January 2020, the court again sentenced Connor Chapman, this time to 10 months in prison. He was again caught in a public place with a cold weapon and substances in his pocket, a whole bouquet of violations. During this period, the police openly appeared on TV channels, urging the public to beware of this young man. After serving his sentence, he again got involved in crime and was wanted for at least 5 criminal episodes. When he was caught, the young criminal said that he had spent more time behind bars than free, and he did not seem upset about this, but rather proud of his achievements. However, Connor had no intention of stopping there. By the age of 20, his service record had expanded again. By this point, he had received 19 sentences for 43 crimes. But in the summer of 2022, the inadequate young man found himself free again. This happened just 6 months before the death of Elle Edwards. During this period, Connor was again brought before the court. His lawyer tried to play on pity, telling the story that the first child of the young man was born while he was in prison. At this point, his girlfriend was pregnant with a girl. The young man claimed that he had rethought his life and wanted to get on the path of correction. Of course, these were loud, false words. The only thing he wanted was to get free and return to the path of crime. During this period, the police already knew that he was a member of one of the local criminal gangs engaged in the sale of prohibited substances. However, the criminal was tried not for these serious crimes, but for burglary and theft of 2 electric motorcycles. On December 24, 2022, a skirmish broke out between 2 rival criminal gangs. They began to argue over the division of the territory near the wooden church in Beechwood Estates. They failed to reach an agreement, after which the young gangster decided to take revenge. He armed himself with a submachine gun and waited for about 3 hours until he tracked down his targets. He wanted to kill Kieran Sockled and Jake Duffy, who had gone to the pub for rest. Shortly before midnight, the criminal drove up to the parking lot and began to observe. He identified his victims and waited for the right moment to attack, then ran out of a car and fired 12 bullets into the building. He managed to seriously injure Duffy, but despite the threat to his life, he survived the attack. However, the unlucky Elle Edwards was not so fortunate. 2 bullets hit her in the head. The young beauty fought for her life but died in the arms of the medics on the way to the hospital. The girl accidentally met the killer's targets that evening and did not even suspect that the festive revelry could end so tragically. The pub was crowded. Then 1 person was killed and 4 were wounded. One 22-year-old man was shot in the leg. A 24-year-old young man was wounded in the arm and a 33-year-old man in the wrist. None of these injuries were life-threatening. Elle's friends tried to provide her with assistance and perform artificial respiration right on the spot. However, this was not enough to save her life. Elle's sister Lucy was unharmed. She lived in Dubai and flew home to celebrate Christmas with her family. Just minutes before the attack, she had left the establishment, so she was not affected at all. Later, Lucy recalled how she had wanted to take her sister with her, but the girl wanted to stay with her friends. On January 25, 2023, the funeral of the young girl took place. Hundreds of concerned people came to say goodbye to the random victim of gang showdowns. The body was brought to the local church in a hearse drawn by 4 white horses. Even the pub that had become the site of the girl's last celebration was closed that day as a mark of respect for her memory. The owner of the establishment published a message of support for Elle's family on his official social media page. Connor Chapman was charged with a whole list of charges, the main one of which was murder. It became known that the perpetrator had an accomplice, namely 20-year-old Thomas Waring. After the arrest and during the searches, a video recording was found on this young man, which had been made shortly before the attack. In it, Connor is handing over a weapon and saying that he is going to settle accounts with someone. After the attack, they together hid the stolen Mercedes to get rid of it later. The murder weapon was never found. However, the killer's DNA traces were found on one of the shell casings fired. It was obvious that it was Connor who loaded the weapon before the attack. In addition, red gloves were found during searches in his house, which were clearly visible in the CCTV footage from the morning. After the crime, when the perpetrators had abandoned the car, they ordered a taxi under a false name. They used the driver's services to cover their tracks and confuse the investigation. Around 5 a.m., they returned to the place where the hidden car was located. Here, the criminals tried to cover their tracks. However, something went wrong. Ultimately, they decided to get rid of the car by setting it on fire. Thomas Waring was found guilty on all charges brought against him. In July 2023, the court sentenced him to 9 years in prison. This modest sentence was due to the fact that he had not yet managed to accumulate such a wide criminal history as his accomplice. Jake and Kieran were wounded in the moment of the attack, but both managed to survive the assault. A look at their lifestyle made the aggression of one of the members of the rival gang quite understandable. Both were members of the local Beechwood gang, which was openly in conflict with another group claiming this territory. It became known that on December 23, 2022, just a day before the attack with firearms, they had already been attacked. On that occasion, another person from Connor Chapman's group had assaulted them. Both were beaten but did not receive serious injuries. Apparently, they considered this a random fight and calmly went to relax in the pub. While the shooter awaited his sentence in the case of the murder of the innocent victim, both targets of his attack were already in prison. Kieran was sentenced to 27 months in prison for an attack on members of the rival criminal group. Another 9 months were added to the sentence for the fight. His friend was sentenced to 2 years and 9 months for a similar offense. Obviously, they were trying to avenge the attempted murder. Prohibitive court orders were also issued against both of them with a whole list of restrictions. Of course, this method did not allow protecting citizens from this gang of criminals. However, in case of further violations, more severe punishment could be applied to them due to ignoring the prescriptions. The public was outraged that potentially dangerous members of criminal gangs were getting away with minimum sentences after each crime. The bans were clearly ineffective and did not contribute absolutely anything to public safety. This became especially obvious when it was found that Chapman already had a ban on visiting the region where the pub was located. But this did not prevent him from stealing a car and coming to the public place, despite the fact that he also had a driving ban. The events that had occurred once again raised the question of toughening punishments and revising the existing norms of the legal system. However, so far this flawed system has not suffered any serious changes. At the trial on the case of Elle's murder, Connor tried to refute that it was he who appeared on the CCTV footage. According to him, during this period he was at home, packing Christmas gifts. However, a sufficient amount of evidence was collected to expose the lie. The hearings on the case lasted 3.5 weeks, during which all the circumstances preceding the attack were revealed. It became known that the reason for the attack was only the competition between the two criminal gangs dividing the territory nearby. The defendant did not even know the victim. He simply did not care about her fate, as well as the fate of all the other innocent people in the bar. He was driven only by blind fury, which he could never control. After the attempted murder of two competitors, Connor planned to flee to Spain to cover his tracks. He used a stolen car and also got rid of the murder weapon, trying not to fall into the hands of the police. He avoided using any mode of transport. The detectives detained the criminal literally at the airport. After the arrest, Connor tried to deceive the police, claiming that the Mercedes he was seen driving on the day of the murder was not stolen. According to him, this was a common car of the criminal group, which they used for the distribution of substances. The guy claimed that he was not behind the wheel of the vehicle and also continued to convince the jury that he did not open fire that evening. He was desperately trying to get out of the situation. The defendant stated that he had only just learned that someone from the criminal group had used the vehicle for an attack on the pub. Before the jury retired to consider the verdict, the father of the innocent victim made a short speech. He sincerely hoped that the criminal would never again be able to spend Christmas with his loved ones in freedom. The jurors came to a unanimous decision after 3 hours of discussion. In their opinion, Connor Chapman was guilty of all the charges brought against him. He cynically committed the crime and did not repent of the fact that he accidentally killed the beautiful 26-year-old girl. The whole life that lay ahead of her, he took it away. Instead of remorse, the heartless Connor spent several days carefully getting rid of all the evidence and traces of the murder that could link him to this bloody event. The motive for the attack was the competition between criminal gangs. On July 7, 2023, Connor was sentenced. He was sent to serve a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 48 years from the start of serving the sentence. After the verdict was announced, the victim's father victoriously raised his fist. The incident provoked a wave of public outrage. The residents of the city could not feel safe, knowing that they were at the junction of the confrontation between criminal gangs dividing spheres of influence. They knew that these people had a large amount of firearms and were not afraid to use them, as proved by the murder of Elle. The girl's father said he wanted to set up a foundation to support victims like his daughter. He believed that the main goal would be to fight to reduce the number of weapons in the hands of civilians. Vanessa Markwart was born on June 17, 1989 in the small town of Leominster, Massachusetts. Her parents divorced soon after her birth, but Vanessa's father remained very involved in her life. He stayed in the same town and tried to spend as much time as possible with his daughter. From a young age, Vanessa developed a strong love for nature and sports, thanks to her father. They often went hiking, skied in the nearby mountains, and visited the ocean to enjoy the beach. Later on, Vanessa became passionate about yoga and jogging, even taking part in 2 major charity marathons. Vanessa was also dedicated to her education and aimed to build a successful career. After high school, she went to Boston University and earned a degree in communications. She worked at several local companies before landing her dream job at Google, which led her to move to New York City. Vanessa was excited about her new job and worked hard to move up in her career. Even with her busy schedule, she made time for charity, trying to help others. Vanessa also tried to visit her family as often as possible. They lived in a small town called Princeton, not far from her hometown, which was about 180 miles from New York. In early August 2016, when Vanessa was 27, she visited her family for the weekend and stayed at her mom's house. She spent time with relatives, caught up with friends, and planned to head back to New York on Sunday, August 7th. That morning, Vanessa spent some time at home with her mom, and in the afternoon, she decided to go for a jog. With a few hours left until her bus, she had plenty of time to enjoy her run. She decided to run along the road near her mother's house. Although there were a few other houses along the way, they were mostly hidden by dense trees. Vanessa was supposed to be back in about half an hour. She never returned. Her mom started to worry, knowing Vanessa still had to pack and catch her bus. She tried calling her, but Vanessa didn't pick up. About an hour after she left the house, Vanessa's phone started going straight to voicemail, making her mom even more anxious. She kept trying to reach her daughter, but there was no response. Her last hope was that Vanessa might have decided to meet some friends or visit other family members before heading back to New York. Her mom contacted all their relatives, but none of them had seen Vanessa. Fearing something bad had happened to her daughter, she decided to call the police. Officers spoke with her mom and began searching along the route Vanessa was supposed to jog. Her relatives and friends quickly joined the search, hoping to find her safe and well. Vanessa's bus to New York was scheduled to leave at 5:30 p.m., and everyone hoped she would show up by then. But when the bus left without her, it became clear that something serious had happened. Vanessa was very responsible about her work and would never miss the last bus. The search went on for several hours. The local police department requested assistance from the state police, who sent several officers with search dogs. Vanessa's father actively participated in the search and was extremely distressed. At one point, the police even had to ask him to go home because his anxiety was disrupting the process. Around 8:20 p.m., one of the search teams headed deeper into the woods, less than a mile from Vanessa's mother's house. The dogs led the officers in a specific direction, and soon they discovered a human body on the ground. Despite numerous bruises, the police immediately realized it was Vanessa Markwart. Her clothes were missing except for one sneaker lying near the crime scene. In addition to the bruises, there were clear signs of burns on her body, and the sneaker was also partially burned. The police thought that the perpetrator might have attempted to dispose of the body and evidence using fire, but failed. They also suspected that Vanessa had been assaulted, which could have been the motive for the unknown killer. Detectives noted that along with the victim's clothes, her headphones and smartphone were also missing. Since these items were not found anywhere near the body, the perpetrator might have taken them. The body was handed over to medical examiners while the police began searching for suspects. Residents of Princeton, who quickly learned about what had happened, were shocked and scared. Their small town was considered very safe, and the last murder had occurred over 30 years ago. Now, with the news of Vanessa's murder and the horrific details, the town plunged into panic. People feared that the killer might be one of their own and worried that he could strike again. Medical examiners determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Vanessa had also sustained numerous injuries, some indicating that she had tried to fight off her attacker. Skin particles were found under her nails, and DNA analysis revealed that they belonged to an unknown man. Investigators immediately entered his DNA profile into the FBI database, but no matches were found. Despite this, the DNA profile became their only major piece of evidence. Now, the police could compare DNA samples from suspects with this profile. They also knew that the attacker likely had fresh scratches on his body, which could help identify him more quickly. Regarding the burns on Vanessa's body, experts found traces of an accelerant and determined it was gasoline. It seemed like the perpetrator had tried to use it to destroy evidence and the body right after the murder. The medical examiners couldn't conclusively determine if Vanessa had been sexually assaulted, but detectives continued to consider it a primary motive. They also didn't rule out the possibility that the attacker might have known the victim and had personal motives. Detectives put all their efforts into finding the perpetrator and turned to the local community for help. With Princeton's population of just 3,000, many residents knew each other, so the police hoped someone might have crucial information. They also asked people to be on the lookout for a man with fresh scratches, and soon their efforts paid off. A witness came forward, saying he had been driving along the road on the day of the murder around 12:45 p.m. He saw a dark SUV with the hood up on the roadside and a Latino man standing next to it. The man was of medium height and solid build, appearing to be between 20 and 30 years old. The witness didn't recall any other details since he had driven by at high speed. The only detail he could provide was that the man had short hair or a completely shaved head. An hour and a half later, the witness drove back along the same road and noticed the SUV was still there. This time, the hood was down, all the windows were closed, and the man was nowhere to be seen. The witness added that he hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after hearing about Vanessa's murder, he realized he might have seen the perpetrator. Another witness reported seeing Vanessa that day as she headed toward the road. According to him, a car was following her. The driver first passed by, then turned around and started following her again. Unfortunately, the witness couldn't see the license plate or remember any other details about the car. Soon, detectives received another lead. A witness working at a ski resort 10 minutes drive from Princeton noticed a suspicious man with a scratched face. This man was caught on surveillance camera and the witness provided the footage to the police. Thanks to the footage, they quickly identified the man and began investigating his possible involvement, but soon concluded that he was likely not the killer. A DNA analysis later confirmed this and the man was cleared of suspicion. Over the next few weeks, police received more than 1,000 tips, some of which seemed very promising. They diligently checked each one but repeatedly hit dead ends, failing to get any closer to catching the culprit. Detectives investigated local residents as well as people from other towns. They also looked into owners of dark SUVs, but none of these efforts yielded results. Vanessa's family couldn't sit still and wanted to contribute to the investigation. They put up flyers with information about the case in nearby towns and launched a website with all the details about the case. Despite the large number of tips and the community's involvement, with each passing week, investigators grew more and more discouraged. They had checked hundreds of men in the area and looked into Vanessa's acquaintances, but each lead ended up going nowhere. Several FBI profilers studied the case and concluded that the person who killed Vanessa most likely didn't know her and committed the crime spontaneously. They suggested that he might have driven by, seen Vanessa, and decided to assault her. They also noted that the perpetrator was likely living in Princeton or nearby towns or regularly visiting Princeton, possibly to see relatives or for work. Given the brutality of the attack, the profiler speculated that the killer might be a sociopath, making him harder to identify. Sociopaths not only lack guilt but are also skilled liars. The murderer could have acted completely normal after the crime, as if nothing had happened, and avoided drawing attention to himself. In the following months, the case made little progress, even though the local police department continued to work diligently on it. However, the more leads they followed, the less likely it seemed that they would be able to identify the perpetrator. But everything suddenly changed 9 months after the murder in a quite unexpected way. In April 2017, a state patrol officer was driving through the town of Worcester, about 18 miles from Princeton. At one point, he spotted a black SUV with a Latino man with short hair behind the wheel. Vanessa's case was well known among the police in the area, so the officer immediately recalled that the driver's appearance and vehicle matched witness descriptions. The patrol officer quickly grabbed a pen and wrote down the license plate number on his hand while the vehicle was still in view. Upon returning to the station, he checked the plate and found that the SUV was registered to a 31-year-old Angelo Ortiz, and he passed this information along to the detectives. Ortiz had no criminal record and had been living in Worcester with his girlfriend and 3 children for less than a year. Officers went to his house to request a DNA sample, but there was a problem. When Ortiz opened the door, they realized he barely spoke English. Fortunately, one of the officers knew Spanish, and Ortiz's girlfriend, who was also home, helped translate for him. During the conversation, Ortiz provided a DNA sample which was immediately sent to the lab. While waiting for the results, detectives decided to dig deeper into Ortiz's background. They discovered that he worked as a delivery driver, transporting packages from a warehouse to various post offices in the area. This indicated that he knew the area well and frequently visited nearby towns like Princeton. Detectives also requested GPS data from Ortiz's smartphone, and the results were quite intriguing. Although the carrier could only provide approximate data based on cell towers, it showed that Ortiz was in Princeton at the time of Vanessa's attack, specifically in the area where her body was found. Digging deeper, police learned that after the murder, Ortiz made a purchase at a gas station in a neighboring town, just a few miles away. He bought only $5 worth of gasoline, as shown by his bank records. He had filled a small gas can, and as we recall, traces of gasoline were found on the victim's body. All of this strongly suggested to the detectives that Ortiz was likely involved in the crime. Soon they received the lab results. His DNA matched the skin particles found under Vanessa's nails. With confirmation of his involvement, the police finally arrested Ortiz. He denied any involvement in the murder, so the case went to court. With the evidence they had, including DNA results and GPS data from the day of the murder, the prosecution was confident they could secure a conviction. However, an unexpected problem arose. When Ortiz hired lawyers, they claimed that the police had obtained his DNA sample illegally, meaning it should be excluded from the evidence. They argued that the language barrier prevented Ortiz from understanding what was happening and from giving consent to the DNA collection. Ortiz insisted that he had signed a document he didn't understand and only provided the DNA sample because his girlfriend told him to do so. This situation posed a major challenge for the prosecution. Even with the undeniable DNA match, the defense's request could have jeopardized the case and led to Ortiz being released. The matter was deliberated for quite some time, but ultimately the judge decided to uphold the DNA test results. Despite this, Ortiz still refused to confess, and the preparations for the trial dragged on for several years. Throughout this period, Ortiz remained in jail as he was unable to pay the $10 million bail. In total, the wait for the trial lasted over 6 years from the time of the murder, with multiple delays for various reasons. For Vanessa's family, who had already suffered an immense loss, the waiting was extremely painful. During this time, investigators gathered more information that cast Ortiz in an unfavorable light. Though he had lived in the city for less than a year, Ortiz had earned a bad reputation. Several women in his neighborhood told police that they found Ortiz extremely unpleasant. He often made rude, intimate comments about them, and they were afraid to be near him. A former employee of the Princeton post office shared some interesting details. She frequently encountered Ortiz at work because he had been delivering packages. Almost every day, he made inappropriate comments in Spanish about her and another employee, seemingly unaware that she understood the language. She felt very uncomfortable every time he came by and was genuinely afraid of him. Moreover, this woman often walked to work along the same road where Vanessa had jogged. After hearing about Vanessa's death, she could no longer bear to live in the town and moved out. Eventually, the prosecution decided to offer Ortiz a deal, giving him a chance to be released, at least in old age. Without the deal, he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. So after some consideration, Ortiz agreed, and in October 2022, he pled guilty before the judge. As is often the case, the terms of the deal did not require Ortiz to provide any details of his crime. He only needed to admit his guilt, which he did. While the deal might seem unfair, the prosecution secured pretty strict terms. Ortiz was sentenced to 20 years for robbery, as he had taken Vanessa's phone and headphones, and received a sentence of 25 years to life with the possibility of parole only after 45 years. This means Ortiz can seek release only after he turns 81. Tragically, Vanessa's father, who had been awaiting justice for his daughter's murder, passed away just 10 days before the sentencing due to health problems. At the trial, his ex-wife stated that he died of a broken heart and unbearable grief caused by the murder. Ortiz himself showed no signs of remorse or regret during his sentencing. Instead, he asked his lawyer to read a statement on his behalf. The lawyer stated that Ortiz understood why Vanessa's family saw him as a monster. However, He asked them to remember that he is also a person with a family that had supported him throughout the ordeal. He apologized to his own family for the pain he had caused them, but did not apologize to Vanessa's relatives. Ortiz was then sent back to prison, where he remains to this day. After Vanessa's death, her family and friends founded an organization named in her honor. Initially, they focused on offering self-defense courses for women, but over the years, their goals have expanded significantly, and now they work on a wide range of issues related to women's safety and the prevention of violence in all its forms. From the outside, the England family seemed like the epitome of perfection. Every Sunday they attended church together, demonstrating exemplary piety. However, few people in their circle could imagine the secrets hidden behind the closed doors of this respective household. The story of William and Sandler began back in 1983, when they first met at church. He was 18 and she was only 16. With their parents' blessing, the young couple soon got married and settled in the small town of Logan. Bill Inman considered himself a deeply religious man. Working as a builder, he dedicated his free time to serving at the Evangelical Church of the Tabernacle of Faith, located near Nelson Villa. There, Bill played musical instruments, while Sandra, being a housewife, supported her husband in his spiritual pursuits. In 1984, the couple welcomed their firstborn, son named William Jr. To avoid confusion, the church community called the father Bill and the son Will. As the years flew by, Will gradually grew up. In 2001, when he turned 17, he met 15-year-old Summer Cook during a church service. The circumstances of their meeting remarkably resembled the love story of Bill and Sandra. The young couple dated for 3 years, and when Summer reached adulthood in 2004, they got married. The newlyweds immediately moved in with Will's parents in their spacious house in Logan. That same year, 39-year-old Bill Inman proclaimed himself a spiritual leader. He transformed his garage into a makeshift church and began holding services there. Despite the skepticism of local residents towards the self-proclaimed pastor, his mysterious home church gradually began attracting parishioners, first neighbors, and then their acquaintances. People came to pray, find solace, and leave donations. In 2005, Will and Summer became happy parents of a boy named Alex. However, along with the joys of parenthood, the young couple faced financial difficulties. Bill's church activities did not bring in substantial income, so the family decided to try their luck in another state. In search of a better life, the Inlands moved to Florida in 2006. In their new location, Bill and Will quickly found work in the construction industry, building hotels. Meanwhile, Sandra and Summer took care of the home and raised little Alex. However, after just 2 years longing for their hometown, the family returned to Ohio. Unfortunately, during their absence, they had lost the right to buy back their previous house in Logan. They had to rent another place in the rural area of Vinton. Almost immediately after returning, in 2008, Will and Summer became parents again this time. They had a daughter named Kaylee. 2 years later, the couple's third child, a girl named Alana, was born. Despite the challenges of raising young children, the young parents tried to set aside time for themselves. Almost every weekend, they left the kids under the care of Bill and Sandra, who gladly took on the roles of grandmother and grandfather. For the elderly couple, their grandchildren became the true meaning of life. In the spring of 2010, Bill Inman officially became a pastor heading the Church of the Tabernacle of Faith. Together with his wife, he also founded a charitable organization called Ranch of Mercy, aiming to help the underprivileged, those who had lost their jobs or homes. Bill dreamed of building a large shelter for orphans and widows with his own hands. However, there was a lack of funds to realize this plan. That's when Bill came up with the idea of holding a lottery. By selling tickets for $10 each, he hoped to raise the necessary amount. The lucky winner would receive a new house or $200,000. Additionally, Bill promised to raffle off 99 other valuable prizes. Information about the lottery was disseminated through local media and advertising. Bill personally went door to door, urging people to join the good cause and purchase tickets. He assured that the proceeds would go towards building a shelter for the needy. In total, Inman managed to sell 100,000 tickets and raise $1 million. The prize draw was scheduled for September 2010. While Bill was engaged in charity work, problems were brewing in Being Man's personal life. In June 2010, Summer confessed to her husband that she wanted a divorce after 6 years of marriage. Shortly before this, she made a bitter entry in her diary. "I'm so tired of pleasing everyone. So exhausted. Don't I deserve happiness? Don't I have the right to fall in love again and feel loved in return? Maybe it's not the best time, but I have to tell Will the truth. He needs to know that I don't want to be with him anymore. I need to be alone, figure myself out, understand who I really am. Because right now, I'm just a slave who follows orders. I love my children endlessly and wouldn't trade them for anything. But I don't want them to see their mother simply obeying someone else's will. I don't know how Will is going to react to this. Maybe he'll get furious, try to take the kids and run away, or start threatening, hurting me. I think we should have equal time with the children. I know his parents will be against it and will try to convince me to stay. But I understand that it won't change anything. Yesterday, Will asked me what I want and I couldn't answer because I only know what I don't want to be unhappy, to feel trapped. But I remained silent. Every day, all I can do is cry and sleep, nothing more. Just don't know how to get out of this situation and make everything all right. I hope that the next time I write here, I'll have found the answer." Summer filed for divorce and moved out of the Inman's house with the children and essential belongings to her parents' home. She didn't want to deprive Alex, Kaylee, and Alana of communication with their father, so she allowed them to see Will and his parents. 2 months after leaving her husband, Summer started a romance with Adam Peters. At the same time, she got a job as a cleaner at a bank located in the center of Logan. The woman had no education, so she couldn't find other work. Meanwhile, September and October passed, but the house lottery promised by Bill from Ranch of Mercy never took place. Moreover, it turned out that the construction of the prize house hadn't even begun. The organization was in no hurry to return people's money for the tickets. In early December 2010, the Inmans were informed about the need to vacate their rented housing due to debt. Upon learning this, Summer came with Adam to pick up the belongings that were left there. However, Will and his parents didn't let their former daughter-in-law in. Summer called the police and complained that her husband, whom she was divorcing, was threatening her and wouldn't give back her personal belongings. When law enforcement arrived, continued to refuse to let anyone into the house, threatened to shoot Adam, and even got into a fight with a police officer. In her statement, Summer said that before the wedding, she and Will had an ideal relationship. But after getting married, he changed abruptly, started controlling her every step, being jealous, and making groundless accusations. He dictated to his wife what to do and when, interfering in the most intimate areas of life, eating habits, household chores, even sexual relations. Samna couldn't even get enough sleep without her husband's permission. He effectively kept her under house arrest, forbidding her to leave the home. He hid her mobile phone and keys. The woman admitted that Will dreamed of having 12 children with her and even planned to take a second wife. He could often be seen on websites for polygamous families where he posted his explicit photos. Will threatened to kill Summer if she dared to leave him. Once he even took her beloved cats, drove them somewhere, and then lied that they had escaped through an open window. He laughed, saying she would never see them again. After his wife's accusations, Will tried to justify himself. He claimed he took away her phone and keys because he suspected her of cheating. As for the cats, he simply took them to a shelter because they were scratching the furniture and attacking family members. Will was prohibited from approaching Summer and was sentenced to a fine and probation. At the same time, a custody battle erupted between the two families. The Inmans filed a police report accusing Adam Peters of being dangerous to Alex, Kaylee, and Alana. A terrifying event occurred late in the evening of March 22, 2011. 25-year-old Summer was finishing her shift at the bank. As usual, she cleaned up the workspaces and went outside around 11 p.m. to take out the trash. Before that, Summer had sent a message to Adam, whom she was supposed to meet after work, but he never saw his beloved again. Worried, Adam went to the bank after midnight. He didn't find Summer, but near the dumpster, he saw her belongings, her phone, keys, a running player with headphones. A little further in the bushes lay her jacket. Adam called the police and informed Summer's parents about her disappearance. At first, the family thought the woman might have been delayed at work or lost her personal items, but the bank's security service assured them they hadn't seen her after the end of her shift. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, several witnesses were already waiting. 2 women who were out for a jog at the time said they had witnessed Summer being abducted by unknown individuals an hour earlier. According to them, when the woman approached the dumpster, a white Ford Crown Victoria, driven by a blonde, pulled up. 2 men in black balaclavas jumped out of the car, grabbed Summer, and forcibly pushed her into the back seat. The victim resisted, screamed, and begged for help. One of the witnesses tried to intervene, but the female driver sprayed pepper spray in his face. After that, the kidnappers fled with Summer. The women immediately ran to the nearest police station and reported what they had seen. However, for some reason, law enforcement treated their statement with skepticism, even suspicion. They decided that the witnesses had made up this story for fun. A whole hour passed after Summer's parents contacted the police before they finally arrived at the crime scene. Unfortunately, it was too late. The missing woman could not be found while the trail was still hot. News of the abduction of 25-year-old Summer Inman instantly spread through the local media. Hundreds of concerned residents of Logan rallied to help with the search. But days passed, and hope of finding the woman alive faded. The parents of the listing tried not to think about the worst. A few weeks before the tragedy, Summer had posted a photo on Facebook with Adam and the children. In it, they looked like a happy family. Seeing this photo on Adam's page, Will Inman became genuinely enraged. There had long been a quiet confrontation between these 2 men. It turned out that Summer had met Adam even before deciding to divorce her husband. In the spring of 2010, Peters got a job working for the Inmans, taking care of their house and yard. That's where he fell for Summer. Initially, the woman rejected Adam's advances, but eventually gave in. In her diary, there was an entry. When our eyes met, I realized that the devil had taken hold of me. I didn't listen to the voice of God. I tried to stop myself. My mind screamed, "Run, get out of here now." But I stayed and allowed Adam to embrace me and then delve deeper. I regret it. I am guilty. Meeting Adam was the beginning of the end for Summer and Will's marriage. The woman realized that she wanted to be happy, to love and be loved, so she filed for divorce. 5 days before Summer's disappearance, Will tried to challenge the amount of alimony in court. He didn't want to pay his ex-wife $150 per child every month and asked to reduce the amount to $50. After all, at that time, his annual income was only $6,500 a month. Will, along with his parents, fought for sole custody of the children, but the judge rejected their demands. Bill and Sandra missed their grandchildren very much, as they were the meaning of their lives. After parting with Summer, the elderly couple had noticeably lost weight and become haggard. In March 2011, shortly after Summer's disappearance, the police found the Inman family. Bill, Sandra, and Will were hiding in the home of Bill's mother, a 70-year-old woman from Jackson County, Ohio. During the interrogation, all 3 unanimously assured that they were not involved in Summer's abduction. They claimed that on the night in question, they had gone to Cleveland to look at a new house. On the way, the car broke down and they had to spend the whole night repairing it on the side of the road. They only returned home to Logan in the morning. The Inman said that they had always treated Summer well and rarely argued with her. But ever since Alan Peters appeared in their home, a dark streak had begun. Bill, Sandra, and Will called Adam a bad person who had destroyed a once happy and strong family, were interested in the white Ford Crown Victoria parked near the Inman's house. They confiscated the car's GPS navigator and checked the route. It turned out that on the afternoon of March 22nd, when the kidnapping occurred, the car was in Logan. In the evening at 5:30 p.m., the GPS was turned off and only turned back on the next morning, March 23rd, again in Logan. No evidence of the Inman's trip to Cleveland could be found. Moreover, according to telephone records, all night from March 22nd to 23rd, the suspects were in Logan. Then information came in that on the morning of March 23rd at 7:30 a.m., Bill, Sandra, and Will were seen at a car wash. They took the car for a full interior cleaning. Summer was not with them. After that, the Indians went to Cleveland, where they changed tires at an auto repair shop. The mechanic found it strange that Bill decided to replace almost new tires with old ones. Allegedly, he simply didn't like the previous ones. The inmates also tried to change the appearance of the car. Bill removed the police spotlight he had once installed near the side mirror. After the arrest, Bill tried to convince his elderly mother that they were not guilty of anything and that these trials were God's punishment. However, after several hours of interrogation, realizing that all three of them faced the death penalty, Sandra gave in. The woman confessed that it was them who had kidnapped Summer on that fateful night. The men in balaclavas were her husband Bill and son Will. According to Sandra, the abduction was entirely her idea. She only wanted to scare her daughter-in-law so that she would allow Will to see the children. When Summer was pushed into the car, Will tied her hands, feet, and neck with plastic ties. The woman fought and screamed, and then suddenly fainted. Will noticed that Summer was showing no signs of life. He wanted to cut the bindings and free her. He shouted to his mother, "Mom, where's the knife? I can't find it." While the family was frantically searching for the knife, a few minutes passed. It was too late to save Summer as she had suffocated. Sandra swore they didn't want to kill their daughter-in-law, only to scare her in order to settle the custody dispute over the grandchildren and have the opportunity to see them at least on weekends. On March 29, 2011, a week after the abduction, Sandra showed where they had hidden the body. Summer was thrown into an abandoned well on the grounds of the church the Inman family attended. The Church of the Tabernacle of Faith is located near Nelsonville, 30 kilometers from the bank where Summer worked. Once, Bill Inman had participated in its construction, and 28 years ago, under the arches of this temple, he and Sandra got married. When the police lifted the concrete lid of the well, a gruesome sight met their eyes. Summer lay at the bottom, her body thrown in head first. The victim was wearing the same clothes as on the last day of her life, a black t-shirt with the words, "Have an anger problem, I have an idiot problem." The autopsy showed that Summer had died of strangulation. There were no other injuries on her body except for marks from the plastic ties on her neck, wrists, and ankles. Sandra said that she had initially planned to throw the body into the river, but then she decided that in the church well, no one would definitely find it. The woman admitted her guilt and expressed sincere regret for what she had done. Soon, trial took place. 49-year-old Bill and 28-year-old Bill did not plead guilty to Summer's murder. They barely spoke during the hearings and avoided looking her parents in the eye. Only Sandra repented for what she had done and tried to take all the responsibility upon herself. She repeated that the abduction was her idea. Delivering her final statement, the woman begged for forgiveness from Summer's parents through tears. Emotions were choking Sandra, but despite this, everyone understood that she sincerely regretted what had happened. "Summer was like a daughter to me," the woman sobbed. "If I could turn back time, I would never have taken this horrible step." In 2012, the court passed the sentence. Bill and Will Inman received life imprisonment without the right to early release. Sandler was sentenced to life in prison with the right to parole after 15 years. The church friends and parishioners unanimously claimed that Bill was in charge of everything in the Inman family. He was the one making the decisions. No one believed that the idea of the kidnapping belonged to Sandra. Everyone knew that Will had been a spoiled boy since childhood, with his parents indulging his every whim. The defendant herself understood that her husband and son were just as guilty as she was. But Sandra tried to take the blame until the very end, hoping to soften their fate. Alex, Kaylee, and Alana remained under the care of Summer's deceased parents. For a long time, they could not explain to their grandchildren where their mother, father, grandmother, and grandfather had gone. The tragedy of the Inman family serves as a warning about how hidden anger, jealousy, and the desire to control someone else's life can lead to fatal consequences. Bill and Sandra, who were a model of piety and family values to everyone, turned out to be real tyrants to their daughter-in-law. Summer became a victim of a toxic relationship where her will and desires were suppressed, and attempts to break free cost her life. Will, raised in such a suffocating atmosphere, grew up selfish and unwilling to compromise. His obsession with the idea of getting his wife and children back at any cost ultimately turned against him. The Inman's terrible crime forever destroyed several families, deprived 3 small children of their mother, and a grandfather and grandmother of their closest person. Yara Gambirasio was born on May 21, 1997 in a small Italian town called Bimbate di Sopra. This quiet place, not far from Milan, has a population of just over 7,000 people and is known for its peaceful life, old architecture, and beautiful nature. Yara's family had lived there for generations. She had loving parents, an older sister, and 2 younger brothers. Yara loved her hometown. She went to the local school, had lots of friends, and was very active in gymnastics. Just a few hundred yards from her home was a big sports center, and Yara went there almost every week. On November 26, 2010, when she was 13, she planned to swing by the gym quickly to return a stereo to her coach. Around 5:15 p.m., she said goodbye to her parents and headed out, saying she'd be back in about an hour. Yara's parents weren't worried about letting her go out alone. Despite her age, their town was very safe and the walk to the gym only took a few minutes. But that evening, they started to get concerned because Yara was late. By 7 p.m., she still hadn't come back, which was unusual. At 7:11, her mom tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. This really worried her parents, so they immediately contacted the police. The case was referred to a police department in a larger nearby city. About 7 miles away, and an experienced detective, Letizia Ruggieri, was assigned to handle Yara's disappearance. She immediately sent officers to the town to start the search and also called in the military police for help. After talking with Yara's parents, they went to the gym to piece together her last movements. Yara's coach confirmed she had come by around 5:30 p.m. Her friends also said they saw Yara, chatted with her, watched her do some exercises, and then saw her leave for home. The police also learned that at 6:44 p.m. Yara had sent a text to a friend, which was the last time anyone heard from her. So, the investigators determined that Yara disappeared somewhere between the sports complex and her home on her way back. They split into several groups, with one combing the streets and another searching for witnesses and other clues, like CCTV footage. Several people who were near the sports center that evening reported seeing a girl who looked like Yara. They said she was speaking with 2 men near a red car, but the police couldn't confirm if it was really her. They searched the entire sports center but didn't find Yara. Meanwhile, local and military police officers were scouring the streets, fields, and the banks of a small river running through the town. Firefighters and volunteers also joined the search, but no one could find Yara. The detective then called in canine units. The search dogs picked up Yara's scent from her belongings, but instead of leading the police from the sports center towards her home, the dogs indicated that Yara had moved in the opposite direction, towards a small town called Mapello. Letizia also requested Yara's cell phone location data, which showed that her phone had connected to a tower in Mapello at 6:49 p.m., just 5 minutes after she sent a text to her friend. Given the distance from the sports center, it was almost certain that Yara couldn't have gotten there on foot, so she must have been transported by a vehicle. At this point, Yara's trail went cold, and the police had 2 main theories. The first, and most likely, was that she had been kidnapped. The second was that she might have run away, but there were serious doubts about this. In her last message, she had made plans to meet a friend the next day, making it hard to believe she would decide to run away just minutes later. Despite their doubts, the investigator interviewed all of Yara's relatives and friends, but nothing indicated any issues at home. Letizia ordered wiretaps on the phones of all family members and several dozen other people. She took a bold step and requested cell phone location data for every phone that was in Mapello on the evening of Yara's disappearance. If it was indeed a kidnapping, perpetrator's phone would have connected to the towers in the area, but identifying the culprit would still be extremely challenging. In total, the police received information on 15,000 phones that were in the town that evening. They attempted to scrutinize each of these individuals and a special team was set up to monitor thousands of numbers that seemed suspicious for various reasons. Meanwhile, active searches for Yara continued, but day after day, they yielded no results. Letizia began to doubt that they would make any progress this way, and her last hope rested on the cell phone numbers, one of which had to belong to the kidnapper. Within a few days, the police had listened to thousands of hours of phone conversations, but none of them were related to Yara's disappearance. This continued until late November, when one of the officers suddenly heard a highly suspicious phrase. A man on the phone said, "Forgive me, Lord, I didn't kill her." Investigators quickly identified the man as Mohammed Fikri, a construction worker from Morocco who lived in the same town where Yara's phone signal had last been detected. The police tried to locate him, but there was a problem. The team monitoring the phone conversations was listening to recordings with a few days' delay because it was impossible to process so many calls in real time. Fikri's call was only heard 3 days after it was made, and by the time the police became interested in him, he was already on a ship heading to Morocco. All of this looked extremely suspicious, so the Italian authorities decided to intercept the ship. They found the man, arrested him, and brought him back to Italy. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered another chilling clue. They found Fikri's car and discovered a mattress with bloodstains in the trunk. The mattress was immediately sent to the lab, but here the police faced an unexpected twist. The blood didn't belong to Yara, apparently wasn't even human. Upon further analysis of the cell phone recording, it was revealed that Fikri had said something completely different in his native language, and the officer had mistranslated the second part of the phrase. After conducting additional checks, investigators confirmed that Fikri had nothing to do with Yara's disappearance, and they had to release him. By that time, Yara's case had become one of the most well-known topics across Italy, with extensive coverage in the national media. Millions of people followed the search efforts, hoping she would be found alive. When news of Fikri's arrest hit the papers, many were convinced that the kidnapper had finally been caught, so the news of his innocence came as a shock and disappointment. It meant the investigators were back to square one, with no other leads to help them find Yara. The police continued to monitor phone conversations, search for other evidence, and do everything they could, but nothing seemed to lead anywhere. This continued for exactly 3 months, until February 26, 2011. On that day, a man from a small town 6 miles from Yara's home went to one of the many nearby fields to fly his remote-controlled airplane. But the airplane had some issues, and he had to land it in a spot with tall, thick grass to prevent it from crashing into the ground. When he went to retrieve it, he noticed a pile of rags. At first, he didn't think much of it. Then he saw boots sticking out from under the pile and decided to call the police. Officers found a human body under the rags, but the level of decomposition made it almost impossible to visually identify the victim. However, when Letizia arrived at the scene, she immediately knew it was Yara. She was wearing the same clothes she had on when she went to the sports complex 3 months earlier. Near the body, they also found her iPad, house keys, SIM card, and the removable battery from her cell phone, but the phone itself was nowhere to be found. Italy's most renowned forensic pathologist was brought in to examine the remains and concluded that the cause of death was multiple stab wounds. She also found no signs of assault, but the fact that some of her clothing was removed led investigators to suggest that this was the motive. Experts also found fibers on the body that were commonly used in a specific type of fabric. This suggested that the killer might work in a related manufacturing facility somewhere in the area. Additionally, they found 2 foreign DNA samples, one on the victim's gloves and another on the battery of her smartphone. However, there were several issues. The samples were quite small, making it difficult to extract a full profile. There were also no matches in the various databases. So, the investigators found themselves at another dead end. But 2 months later, Letizia received an unexpected call. Experts from the lab reported that, upon further investigation of the victim's belongings, they had discovered biological material on her underwear, and the analysis yielded a full DNA profile of an unknown man. With the killer's DNA in hand, Letizia divided the officers into different teams and assigned them specific tasks. Some were responsible for collecting DNA samples from all of Yara's relatives, acquaintances, and everyone at the sports complex. Others focused on analyzing cell phone location data, compiling a list of numbers belonging to people who traveled from Yarastown to Mapello that evening, and then collecting their DNA samples. Given the scale of these tasks, she had to wait weeks for results, which were slow in coming. Even with 3 laboratories across Italy working on the DNA samples, the process could take years. In the following months, the police collected thousands of DNA samples, but none matched the killer's profile. Meanwhile, Letizia kept thinking how to get new leads, and soon she had an idea. Not far from the field where Yara's body was found, there was a nightclub. Letizia knew that killers often leave their victims' bodies in familiar areas, and this club had a reputation for being a hotspot for people with criminal records and other shady individuals. So she decided to try this theory and collect DNA samples from all the visitors of that nightclub. Letizia assigned several officers to stand guard at the nightclub on Fridays and Saturdays, collecting DNA samples from everyone entering. Since all clubgoers had membership cards, investigators could access information on everyone who had visited the club in the past. Although Letizia knew the chances of success were slim, she wanted to try everything in her power due to the lack of other leads. And soon, she received a call from the lab. DNA from one of the visitors matched the killer's profile. The man's name was Damiano, but there was a problem. The match was only partial, and Damiano was quickly cleared as a suspect since he was on another continent at the time of Yara's disappearance. But still, this was a significant breakthrough. Experts assumed that since his DNA only partially matched the killer's profile, Damiano must be related to the actual perpetrator. Letizia and her team began investigating Damiano's family to identify the most likely suspect. Since this was before genetic genealogy became common in criminal investigations, this method was new and extremely challenging. They soon made a surprising discovery. Damiano's mother had worked as a housekeeper for Yara's family for 10 years, but left the job a few years ago. When she found out that someone from her family might be the killer, the woman was deeply shocked. Despite this revelation, the search for the suspect dragged on for many months. Letizia eventually concluded that none of Damiano's immediate relatives were Yara's murderer, which meant they would need to investigate hundreds, if not thousands, of distant relatives. As months passed without progress, the media began accusing Letizia and her team of incompetence and reluctance to work on the case. Several politicians joined in, trying to have the detective removed, but they were unsuccessful. Despite the heavy pressure, Letizia continued to do everything in her power to identify the killer. She and her team examined various family trees and archival records dating back to 1716. They had to review thousands of individuals, repeatedly hitting dead ends. This continued until September 2011, when investigators finally made a breakthrough. One family tree led them to a man named Giuseppe, who was already deceased. However, his widow had preserved some postmarks with his saliva, and experts managed to extract a DNA profile. The results showed that Giuseppe was very likely the father or grandfather of the killer whose DNA was found on the victim's underwear. Giuseppe had 2 sons, and investigators obtained their DNA samples, but they faced another unexpected disappointment. Although the results showed a close match, neither of the sons was the killer. This left Letizia stumped. The killer had to be closely related to this family, but none of the male members showed a complete match. The only remaining possibility was that Giuseppe might have had a child with another woman, a child his family knew nothing about. Detectives focused on this lead, but uncovering such sensitive information proved extremely difficult. They interviewed thousands of people who might have known or seen Giuseppe during his lifetime. Nearly a year later, they got an intriguing clue. Since the 1960s, Giuseppe had been visiting a spa complex in a small town near Milan without his wife. He stayed there for 2 weeks every May and never brought his family along. Letizia requested records of all visitors to the spa complex during those years. To her surprise, these documents were still available, and investigators began examining them. They compiled a list of all the women who stayed at the spa during the same time Giuseppe. This process stretched over a year, but Letizia still couldn't get any closer to identifying Giuseppe's possible lover. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of what they were doing, and the theory about a secret child sparked widespread interest across Italy. Journalists eager to capitalize on this attention began their own searches for children born from extramarital affairs. To their surprise, they uncovered many such stories. In one small village, for example, they found 5 such children. This continued until 2014, when investigators finally made some progress. With the widespread attention on the case and the search for Giuseppe's possible lover, the police received numerous tips, but all of them led to dead ends. But in the summer of that year, they received a tip suggesting that Giuseppe might have had an affair with a woman named Esther Artsufi. Reviewing their records, investigators suddenly discovered that they had already collected a DNA sample from Esther 2 years earlier. However, the results showed she was not related to the killer. Still, Letizia decided to request a new analysis, and the results were shocking. It turned out that the initial expert had mistakenly compared the killer's DNA with Yara's DNA instead of Esther's. When a different expert re-examined the correct samples, they found that Esther was indeed the killer's mother. With the long-awaited confirmation in hand, Letizia discovered that Esther had 3 children, including twins, a boy and a girl, who fit the age profile. Although the twins were considered the children of Esther's legal husband, investigators suspected that in reality Giuseppe was the biological father. Since the killer was clearly male, they focused on Esther's son. At the time of the investigation, he was 42 years old, worked as a construction worker, and lived with his wife and children in Marpello, the same town where Yara's cell phone signal had disappeared. Letizia quickly came up with a plan to obtain his DNA sample without spooking him. She learned that he used a specific road every day and arranged a sobriety checkpoint there. The man, unaware of the real reason, blew into the breathalyzer, which was immediately sent to the lab with his saliva. Almost 4 years after the murder, Letizia finally received long-awaited confirmation. His DNA fully matched the biological sample found on Yara's underwear. This man's name was Massimo Bassetti, and on June 16th he was finally arrested. Bassetti denied any involvement in the crime and claimed he was innocent, so the case went to trial. During the preparations, investigators uncovered several alarming facts that indirectly implicated Bassetti. His browser history showed searches of an unaccepted nature related to minors. On the evening of Yara's disappearance, his cell phone was located in her town but was turned off at 5:45 p.m. and not turned on again until the next morning. Bassetti's car was captured on surveillance footage near the sports center on the same evening, just minutes before Yara vanished. The car had no license plates, making it difficult to identify the driver before Bassetti's arrest. Was confirmed to be Bassetti's vehicle. Interestingly, fibers from his car seats matched the fibers found on the victim's body. The prosecution also called a witness who lived in Yara's town. The woman testified that on the evening of the disappearance, she had gone outside to take out the trash when she saw a car speeding by her house. According to her description, the vehicle resembled Bassetti's car and she saw a child inside. She added that she heard screams coming from the car. Police also discovered that Bassetti frequently stopped at a pizza restaurant on the same street as Yara's home. This suggested that he might have seen her long before the abduction and possibly had been planning the crime in advance. Regarding the surveillance footage, Bassetti claimed he was simply driving home from work that evening, but investigators found that he did not work that day, which was confirmed by his colleagues' testimonies, CCTV footage, and cell phone location data. The trial began in the summer of 2015, a year after Bassetti's arrest, and it quickly captured the attention of millions across Italy. While most people were sure that Bassetti was the killer, no one could have anticipated the twists this trial would reveal. The prosecution's version was clear. Bassetti had likely been watching Yara for days or even weeks before deciding to abduct her after she left the sports complex alone. He then took her to the field where her body was later discovered and killed her. The main theory was that Bassetti had intended to assault her, but for some reason he didn't go through with it. Bassetti's wife testified that he was home with the family having dinner at the time Yara went missing, but this was contradicted by CCTV footage near the sports complex and 3 witnesses who saw Bassetti's car at the time he claimed to be at home. The defense argued that their client was innocent. Bassetti himself claimed he often had nosebleeds, which could have gotten on his clothes and tools. His lawyer suggested that the real killer might have somehow come into contact with Bassetti's blood before the crime, which then ended up on the victim's underwear. The defense also challenged the DNA evidence, claiming that a mistake might have been made. They explained that there are two types of DNA, one that changes significantly between relatives and another one that changes very slowly over generations. The DNA found on the victim's underwear was of the slower changing type. The defense argued that it could belong to anyone related to Bassetti, whether close or distant. But the prosecution's experts countered this, insisting that Bassetti's DNA matched the evidence beyond any doubt. But that wasn't the defense's main argument. During the trial, they dropped a bombshell that caused a huge stir. They named a new suspect, a gem instructor named Sylvia. It turned out that after the body was discovered, experts found Sylvia's blood on the sleeve of Yara's jacket. Sylvia's father revealed that when she came home after Yara's disappearance, she had been crying all night. Investigators also discovered that Sylvia had sent a few messages to her brother on that evening, but both of them deleted it shortly after, so the content of the messages remained unknown. Sylvia herself claimed she couldn't remember why she acted that way, what she had written to her brother, or how her blood ended up on Yara's clothing. In court, she refused to answer questions, just saying, "I don't know." Despite the lack of any clear explanation for these unexpected revelations, there was enough evidence to convict Bassetti. In the summer of 2016, he was sentenced to life in prison, and his lawyers were unable to overturn the verdict. It's worth mentioning that the day after the verdict, his wife visited him in prison and confessed that none of their 3 children were his, admitting she had been unfaithful with several other men. It's also notable that Esther's 3rd child wasn't from her legal husband or Giuseppe, but from another man. Since then, Bassetti has remained in prison, but the story of Sylvia and her blood continues to trouble many who followed the case. Some people find it so suspicious that they question Bassetti's guilt and suggest that he might have been wrongfully accused, with the DNA evidence potentially being manipulated. Nevertheless, this case remains one of the most high-profile in modern Italian history, and all evidence was carefully examined by the country's leading experts, making the likelihood of Bassetti's innocence extremely low. Case of Kristen Rossum. She could have been a scientist, but she chose a different path. Blonde Kristen Rossum, a chemistry graduate from San Diego State University, could have had a brilliant future. Instead, she is serving a life sentence in the Central California Women's Facility for the crime against her husband. Ralph and Constance Rossum had 3 children and were preparing them for an undoubtedly bright future. The children received education from top schools, were tutored, and participated in clubs and sections for talent development. However, the fragile and impulsive Kristen broke, unable to keep up with the pace in pursuit of the ideal. Lying, skipping classes, and the desire to escape reality first introduced her to a sense of ease and oblivion after consuming alcohol. But soon, alcohol stopped providing the desired effect of tranquility, and she became dependent on the controlled substance methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, meth, is the most addictive illicit substance in the USA. Causes paranoia, clouds judgment, euphoria, and hallucinations. Kristen's erratic behavior and detachment from real life caught her parents' attention. After a long conversation, she admitted that she had been addicted to the substance since high school. This behavior was a severe blow for a family of university-educated professionals. After several months of numerous conflicts with her parents, 17-year-old Kristen secretly ran away to Mexico with friends for a holiday. There, she met a man by chance. Tall, handsome Gregory DeVilli, 7 years her senior, seemed like an angel who would save her. And he did. Greg fell in love with the bad. He took on the role of a parent and responsibility for her well-being. With Greg's support, she managed to get a job at a local forensic department as a toxicology assistant. Her skills impressed the employer. Her addiction was forgotten, which worked in her favor, as her job in toxicology provided access to seized controlled substances. As a forensic assistant, graduated from university with honors. Her teachers and employer praised her, handing her the Best Student Award, unaware of the reasons for her love of the chosen profession. Her relationship with Greg lasted about 5 years and ended with a grand wedding on June 5, 1999. Kristen's parents adored Greg and were at ease for their daughter as she had climbed out of the pit of dependency and confidently stood on the road to a promising and happy life. In March 2000, Kristen was hired by the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office as a toxicologist. Toxicologist analyzes body fluids to detect controlled substances. Gregory was working in the biotechnology industry at the time. Kristen quickly grew bored with her monotonous life and began seeking excitement elsewhere. She found an opportunity with a new colleague, Michael Robertson, who had been appointed as the department head. He was married, but that didn't stop a sudden infatuation between them. They couldn't keep their relationship secret for long. Greg found numerous letters exchanged between the secret lovers. The marital relationship deteriorated, but Gregory still hoped to save the marriage, knowing his wife's weaknesses and trying as hard as ever to save her. This time, Kristen didn't want to be saved. She demanded a divorce. On the morning of Monday, November 6, 2000, Kristen was getting ready for work as usual. Greg was ill and stayed home. Kristen was very worried about her husband. In the days following their separation talk, he had been lethargic and unusually calm. She informed his workplace of her husband's illness. She also visited him during her lunch break. Greg was asleep. At 9:22 p.m. that same day, Christine called emergency services to report that her husband, Greg, was not breathing. He had most likely committed suicide because he was home alone. The woman cried into the phone and did not listen to the dispatcher's instructions to examine the body and possibly administer first aid. Police officers and paramedics arriving on the scene at 10:19 p.m. pronounced Gregory de Villiers dead. He was lying on the bedroom floor with his torso exposed, surrounded by scattered rose petals. The room examination suggested that Greg most likely consumed a lethal dose of several controlled substances. Empty vials of powerful painkillers were scattered around and torn wedding photos were found on his bed. During the interrogation, Kristen stated that she had informed her husband of their separation the previous evening. Just 17 months after the wedding, she regretted getting married. She felt she had rushed into it. Greg was too clingy, and she wanted to distance herself. Greg's death was ruled a suicide. The cause of death was strong sedative drugs. Kristen signed the cremation papers. However, Gregory's family and friends refused to believe in such a sudden suicide. None of them noticed any changes in his character or mood. He had not shared his marital problems with anyone. Greg was so opposed to controlled substances that he would never have taken them. Soon, the relatives managed to stop the cremation and insisted on an independent autopsy. The family's persistence allowed for the consideration of a homicide scenario. Soon, toxicological tests revealed that Gregory's body contained an extremely high amount of fentanyl, a pain reliever 150 times stronger than morphine, along with lesser amounts of clonazepam and trace amounts of oxycodone, known as hillbilly heroin. Investigators speculated that, under the strong influence of clonazepam and other detected drugs, someone else administered the lethal dose of fentanyl to Gregory. Kristen became the prime suspect, as fentanyl is not an over-the-counter medication, and she had ample knowledge and access to such drugs. Upon arrival for interrogation at the police station, Kristen's emaciated, unattractive appearance and her doping behavior indicated her drug dependency. This was confirmed by her own statements on the day of Gregory's death. Kristen was inconsistent in her accounts. Initially, Kristen told paramedics that Gregory had not taken any medication, but later she changed her statement, suggesting he might have taken oxycodone. At the hospital, Kristen told a nurse that Gregory might have overdosed on oxycodone. Oxycodone is similar in effect to codeine-based drugs. It can not only relieve pain, but also induce a sense of euphoria. It depresses the respiratory center, and without timely assistance, its use can be fatal. The police considered the possibility that Gregory died from an accidental overdose of cold medicine and oxycodone. In conversations with Kristen, they also learned that Gregory was very upset about their failing marriage, leading Kristen to tell the police that he ended his own life. This was another investigative avenue they explored. On November 8th, a colleague of Kristen's, Russ Lowe, called the police. He informed them about Kristen's affair with her boss. This information shifted the course of the police investigation. Evidence of Kristen's connection with her boss, Dr. Robertson, was found. The evidence included passionate emails they exchanged, as well as computer files and professional articles revealing Dr. Robertson's specialized knowledge of fentanyl. The criminal puzzle was coming together perfectly. It was suspected that Gregory became a threat to the lovers, as he knew that Kristen, with her access to the lab and controlled substances, was secretly using them, and Michael was covering for her. It was a premeditated crime. The challenge for the investigators was to prove it. During interrogation, Michael Robertson told detectives that he was aware of his lover's drug dependency. At that time, no charges were brought against the couple. They were both dismissed from their jobs for violating several rules during the investigation. Serious trouble for Kristen began in January when police raided her home, finding traces of drugs and paraphernalia. She was arrested for the first time but was later released on bail. The investigation progressed as new information emerged. This included Kristen's diary. During its initial examination, investigators hypothesized that it was written by Kristen not for herself, but for an external reader as a means of covering up and affirming her innocence while crafting the appearance of Gregory's perfect self-inflicted demise. On the day of her husband's death, she bought a rose in revealing lingerie actions inconsistent with her distressed demeanor. Medical examination indicated that Gregory was unconscious for at least 6 hours before his passing, and his death could have occurred an hour or an hour and a half before it was confirmed. Additionally, a bruise around a needle injection site on the young man's arm was found, its purpose and executor unexplained. At Kristen's workplace, a shortage of the drug that led to Gregory's demise, as well as other controlled substances, was discovered. Police believed Kristen poisoned Gregory, administering fentanyl without his knowledge. The prosecution built its case on toxicological and medical data. With enough circumstantial evidence, Christine was arrested on June 25, 2001, and charged with first-degree murder. After spending 6 months in custody, she was released on bail. The first trial soon commenced. The prosecution's main theory was the motive for the homicide. They argued that she terminated Gregory because he threatened to tarnish her good girl reputation by revealing her renewed drug use and affair with Michael Robertson. The prosecution claimed Kristen poisoned Gregory with fentanyl. The court heard that fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid, 80 times stronger than morphine. It was suggested that she first tried to end his life with clonazepam, but when that failed, she administered fentanyl. They also argued that she then staged the bedroom to look like Gregory ended his own life, tearing pages from her diary and placing rose petals and a wedding photo around his body. The court heard that Kristen, with a degree in biochemistry, used her knowledge of drugs and chemistry to terminate Gregory. The prosecution also claimed that Kristen hoped to convince her colleagues in the medical examiner's office that Gregory's death was self-inflicted, hiding information about the fentanyl. However, before Gregory's autopsy could be conducted, she was transferred to another lab, and the attempt to substitute toxicological research was unsuccessful. The prosecution presented Kristen's day on November 6th. Early in the morning, she called Gregory's employer to report his absence, then went to work. Her colleagues testified that about an hour after she arrived at work, around 9 a.m., she was seen crying in Michael's office. The apartment building manager where Kristen and Gregory lived reported seeing her return home at 12:10 p.m. At 12:41 p.m., she went to a local grocery store and purchased several items, including a single red rose. Credit card statements confirm this fact. Hours before Gregory's demise, she made multiple calls to Michael. Dr. Brian Blackburn, the San Diego County medical examiner who conducted Gregory's autopsy, testified that Gregory had been deceased for at least an hour before the paramedics arrived. He informed the court that Gregory developed early bronchial pneumonia. This condition arises when secretions, normally expelled through breathing, accumulate in the lungs, because a person is either unconscious or not breathing deeply enough. Dr. Blackburn also informed the court that Gregory's bladder contained a significant amount of urine, which would have been very uncomfortable had he been conscious. This led Dr. Blackburn to conclude that Gregory was breathing poorly for approximately 6 to 12 hours before his death. A person in an unconscious state would not be able to sprinkle rose petals over themselves. Dr. Blackburn showed that the level of clonazepam found in Gregory's blood was not at an overdose level and was not lethal. Dr. Theodore Stanley testified on behalf of the prosecution. He demonstrated that fentanyl is a potent and fast-acting pain reliever with a serious side effect that can lead to a person's respiratory arrest. Dr. Stanley stated that the speed at which fentanyl begins to act depends on the method of its administration. The peak effect occurs about 16 hours after applying a transdermal patch, 20 to 30 minutes after oral ingestion, 15 to 20 minutes after intramuscular injection, and within 5 minutes after intravenous injection. Dr. Stanley informed the court that fentanyl is usually not administered orally because the liver destroys about 65% of it. So only 35% enters the bloodstream. When asked to explain how fentanyl entered Gregory's system, neither Dr. Blackburn nor Dr. Stanley could provide a definitive opinion. Dr. Stanley showed that various concentration levels in Gregory's body, along with data indicating that Gregory was unconscious and breathing shallowly for several hours before his death, suggests that fentanyl was likely administered to Gregory multiple times. The prosecution could not confidently tell the jury how Kristen poisoned Gregory, but there were indications that she might have applied fentanyl patches to his arm while he was asleep. The disappearance of 15 patches from the laboratory where Kristen formerly worked supported this theory as a possibility. The defense asserted Kristen's innocence, acknowledging that fentanyl was the cause of Gregory's death, but claimed he self-administered it, intentionally causing his own demise due to despair over family issues. Kristen testified in court, describing waking up on the morning of November 6th to find Gregory distraught. She called his employer at 7:42 a.m. to report his illness and that he wouldn't be coming to work. She told the court she went to work but returned to the apartment to check on Gregory, having lunch with him afternoon. Christine's testimony. I asked Gregory why he was so upset that morning. He replied that he wasn't feeling well and had taken some oxycodone and clonazepam. He planned to stay home and sleep. I left for work around 2:30 in the afternoon during my lunch break. I came home to check on Gregory. We had lunch. I then went back to work. I got home around 8 o'clock in the evening. Gregory was lying on the bed. I thought he was asleep. I took a bath. When I came out, I tried to wake him up. He was cold. I called the emergency services. The prosecutor cross-examined Kristen, calling her explanation strange. She admitted to lying in the past and about her drug use. He told the court that fentanyl was the perfect poison because it's hard to detect, which she knew well from her job. Medical testimony based on autopsy and toxicological findings proved that Gregory was unconscious for about 6-8 hours, meaning Kristen couldn't have had lunch with her husband that day. The defense claimed that although Dr. Blackburn showed the clonazepam level in Gregory's blood wasn't lethal, taking oxycodone, an opioid, and clonazepam, a benzodiazepine, together could create a synergistic effect, making them more potent. They suggested Gregory might have unknowingly taken the drugs himself. How fentanyl was administered and why high levels were found in his system remained unexplained. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Kristen guilty of first-degree homicide and special circumstances homicide due to the use of poison. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Kristen maintained her innocence and appealed the verdict. The appellate court heard that errors were made by her own defense team. Her lawyers admitted fentanyl caused the death, but failed to test autopsy samples for fentanyl metabolites. This test could have determined whether Gregory swallowed fentanyl, or if the fentanyl found in the samples was a result of laboratory contamination after his death. If fentanyl had been detected only in the samples and never in Gregory's body, the prosecution's theory that fentanyl caused his death would have been incorrect. The appellate court heard that there was a break in the chain of custody regarding the samples. They were placed in a cardboard box with each container marked as a sample from Gregory's body, but the containers weren't sealed. They were supposed to be delivered to the sheriff's office for immediate transfer to an external lab, but the person supposed to receive the samples was absent. So the box remained at the medical examiner's office for about 36 hours before being delivered to the sheriff's forensic lab. The appellate court's argument was that anyone with a key to the medical examiner's office building had access to the samples. Fentanyl could have been added to the samples posthumously. Believed there was a motive to tamper with the samples and frame her for the crime due to various personal relationships and tensions among the staff. Indeed, Kristen argued in the appellate court that on November 8, 2000, Michael informed one of the toxicologists that he had examined a sample of Gregory's stomach contents. The three-judge panel of the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals concluded that Kristen's lawyers erred in not contesting the prosecution's claim that her husband died from a fentanyl overdose. They stated that her legal team should have tested the autopsy samples for fentanyl metabolites rather than just admitting he died in such a manner. However, they did not overturn the verdict, but sent the case back to federal court to determine if this defense error could have altered the trial's outcome. After this decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that federal courts must adhere to the state court's decision when considering such appeals. Based on this ruling, the appellate court voted against holding a hearing on Kristen's case. Her appeal was denied, and she remains in custody. Michael Robertson was implicated as an accomplice in Kristen's trial. Authorities discreetly filed a criminal conspiracy complaint and issued a sealed warrant for the arrest of Michael Robertson, the former boss and lover of convicted perpetrator Kristen Rossum. Robertson, who lives freely and works as a forensic toxicology consultant in Australia since Rossum's husband's demise in 2000, could be arrested and held on $100,000 bail if he ever returns to the United States. Gregory's family filed a lawsuit accusing the county of negligence that allowed Kristen to steal a lethal dose of drugs from the medical examiner's office undetected. In 2006, a U.S. court awarded them $147 million in civil damages. In a case that continues to captivate the nation, Rossum, a former toxicologist at the county medical examiner's office, was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in February 2003 for stealing drugs from the lab and using them to poison her husband, Gregory DeVilliers, staging a suicide scene in their apartment, scattering his body with red rose petals. Christine Jessup was born on November 29, 1974, in the small Canadian town of Queensville. It was a quiet and peaceful place located not far from a picturesque lake. With a population of only about 600 people, Queensville was considered very safe and many residents knew each other well. Christine lived there with her parents and brother, who was 5 years older than her. She loved spending time outside with friends, riding her bike and playing baseball. Christine also had a great love for animals. Once, a bat flew into her room, and unlike her family, she wasn't scared at all. Instead, she said she wanted to keep it as a pet. On October 3, 1984, when Christine was 9 years old, she woke up early as usual and started getting ready for school. Her brother had a toothache, so their mother planned to take him to the dentist in Toronto. This meant that after school, Christine would be home alone until they returned. Despite her age, had stayed home unsupervised many times before. Her parents weren't too worried, as she was very independent and could take care of herself. Before leaving school that day, Christine agreed to meet her best friend after they both got home. She then took the school bus, which dropped her off just a few hundred yards from her house. A few minutes later, Christine's friend arrived at the park where they had planned to meet and began waiting for her. But as time passed, there was still no sign of Christine. Her friend waited a bit longer, then decided to go home. She tried calling Christine, but no one answered. Meanwhile, Christine's mom and brother returned home. The mom quickly realized that her daughter wasn't there, even though it was clear she had come home after school. Her backpack was in her room, and the mail from the mailbox was in the hallway. She also noticed a few strange things. Christine's bike was laying outside, and its kickstand was damaged. Christine loved that bike and always took good care of it, so it was surprising that she would just leave it outside like that. Christine's jacket was also hanging on a high hook in the hallway, a place she clearly couldn't reach on her own. But despite all of this, her mom wasn't initially worried. She thought Christine had just gone out to play, like she had many times before, and decided to wait for her to come back. About an hour later, as it started to get dark outside, her mom began to worry. Even though Christine was independent, she always let her parents know where she was going. Her mom started calling the parents of all of Christine's friends, hoping she was with one of them. But each time, She was told that no one had seen Christine since school. When her mom called Christine's best friend, the girl said they had planned to meet in the park, but Christine never showed up. Realizing that none of her friends had seen Christine, the mother and her son headed out to search the streets. Given the small size of their town, they quickly checked all the places Christine liked to spend time, but she was nowhere to be found. By around 7 p.m., with no sign of her and still no word, the mother decided it was time to call the police. For the local police department, cases like this weren't all that uncommon. Usually, they involved kids who either lost track of time while playing or ran off after a fight with their parents. In most of these situations, the kids were found quickly, without the need for a full investigation. This time, the police organized a search and asked locals for help. Dozens quickly responded and went out to look for Christine. The police also found out that Christine had visited a small store located between her house and the park where she was supposed to meet her friend. She bought some gum, but where she went after that remained a mystery. There were no surveillance cameras back then, so the officers couldn't piece together an exact timeline. They believed she had gone to the store just minutes after getting home from school. The search continued through the night, but they were unable to find Christine. The next day, even more people joined the search efforts, and the police began receiving various tips. However, none of them proved useful. Most reports were of people seeing some girl on the street or in a passing car, but no one was sure it was Christine, and they also couldn't provide any additional details. In the following days, the police began to suspect they were dealing with an abduction. There was little chance Chelsea could go unnoticed when every resident in their small town knew about her disappearance. Her mother was also certain that Christine would never run away from home. Despite this, the police still couldn't locate Christine. They searched her house, but due to their lack of experience, they did it quite unprofessionally. They looked through some of her belongings without dusting for fingerprints. Plus, they allowed neighbors and family friends to visit the house before conducting a proper examination, potentially compromising any evidence. It's worth noting that at the time of Christine's disappearance, her father was in jail. Just a few weeks earlier, he had received a small sentence for a minor fraud. And on the day Christine went missing, her mother and brother had visited him after the dentist appointment. When it became clear that Christine was likely abducted, her father was released from jail to be with his family, and he immediately joined the search for his daughter. The search continued for several weeks, but they were unable to find Christine or any clues that could shed light on her disappearance. The search area expanded to cover the fields and forests surrounding the town, but still nothing turned up. This went on for 3 months until December 31st. While everyone else was getting ready to celebrate the new year, Christine's family had no reason to celebrate. They still held on to hope that she was alive, but that hope was fading. On that day, a man from the town of Sunderland, 35 miles from Queensville, went out to look for his runaway dog. Walking through the wooded area behind his house, he noticed what looked like a small pile of trash and went closer. To his horror, he discovered a human body and immediately returned home to call the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they quickly identified the deceased, even though the body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Lying next to it was a recorder with a piece of paper labeled Christine Jessup. The recorder had been given to Christine at school on the day she disappeared. Officers immediately suspected foul play. Part of her clothing, including her pants and underwear, was found next to the body, while her other clothes were still on her. The body was sent to medical examiners, and the Queensville police reclassified the case as a homicide. Christine had multiple stab wounds, which were determined to be the cause of death, along with numerous abrasions. Experts concluded that she had been assaulted and found foreign biological material on her underwear. However, since DNA analysis wasn't available at the time, this evidence couldn't be used to identify the perpetrator. Investigators believed that Christine was killed elsewhere and then transported to the location where her body was found. They considered it odd that the killer drove 35 miles to leave her body near another town, especially with so many fields and forests around Queensville. Detectives theorized that the killer might have had some connection to Sunderland and chose that spot because he was familiar with it. They were also nearly certain that the perpetrator lived in Queensville and knew Christine, as all signs suggested she might have willingly gone with him or gotten into his car. Investigators repeatedly asked Christine's parents if they had any suspects in mind, but her mother always said she couldn't think of anyone in particular. The police interviewed nearly every resident of the town, investigated several individuals with criminal histories, and followed up on various tips. But they couldn't connect any of them to the crime. This continued until February 14th, when detectives returned to speak with Christine's mother again. They asked her once more if she could think of anyone who seemed suspicious, and this time she remembered something odd. The Moran's family lived next door and were well respected in the town. The head of the family owned a small business and was known for being able to fix almost anything. The residents of Queensville often sought his help. He was well regarded. He had 6 adult children who helped run the business. One of them, 25-year-old Guy Paul Moran, lived with his parents, and Christine's mother remembered a few strange things about him. Guy Paul hadn't participated in the search for Christine, even though almost the entire town had joined the efforts for weeks. And after Christine's body was found, he didn't attend her funeral, despite being the family's closest neighbor. She added that Guy Paul was quiet and reserved. He had a few friends and a girlfriend, but unlike the rest of his family, he kept to himself. He was also passionate about playing the clarinet. This detail caught the detectives' attention, as Christine had a recorder with her at the time of the abduction. They speculated that Guy Paul might have used music to engage Christine in conversation and lure her away. Moreover, Christine would have known him, as he had lived just a few yards from their home all her life. Detectives went to speak with him and asked how well he knew Christine. Guy Paul said they had hardly ever spoken except for one time when her dog ran away and he helped her catch it. When asked where he was on the day Christine disappeared, Guy Paul said he was at work 30 miles away until about 3:30 p.m. He then drove to the store, stopped at a gas station, and got home around 5 p.m. Finally, the detective asked what he thought about Christine. He replied that she was a typical sweet child, but then added an odd remark, but sometimes they grew up to be corrupt. This struck the police as very suspicious, so they began verifying his alibi. Detectives checked his work schedule and found that he finished his shift at exactly 3:32 p.m. That meant even if he had driven straight to Christine's house, he wouldn't have arrived before her mother got home. Further checks confirmed that he had indeed stopped at a grocery store and a gas station, which took about half an hour. His family also confirmed that he arrived home around 5 p.m. and went to bed shortly after because he was tired from work. Based on all this, it simply seemed he didn't have enough time to abduct Christine. However, investigators considered that his family might have been mistaken about when he got home or even covering for him. Detectives asked to search his car and found several fabric fibers in the trunk, which were sent to the lab. Experts soon came to the conclusion that these fibers matched the sweater Christine was wearing the day she disappeared. Several hairs found on Christine's body were also believed to belong to Moran. However, in those days, experts could only visually compare hair samples and suggest similarities or obvious differences like color. Finally, the police consulted an FBI profiler who created a rough profile of the killer based on all available information. The profiler suggested that the suspect was a male from Queensville, aged 19 to 26, with a criminal record for crimes like arson or voyeurism. The profiler provided other characteristics, but detectives focused only on those that matched Moran. He had no criminal record or a bad reputation, so he fit less than half of the profile's criteria. But the police were already convinced Moran was the killer, and on April 22nd, they decided to arrest him. He denied any involvement in the crime and was placed in jail awaiting trial. Christine's parents were shocked to learn that their closest neighbor could commit such a crime. However, the detective's main problem was Christine's mother's statement about the exact time she returned home, for 10 p.m. She was confident about this because she checked the clock as soon as she entered the kitchen. According to the investigators, Moran couldn't have reached their house from his workplace before 4:10 p.m. and would have needed at least another 15 to 20 minutes. So, they kept asking the woman if she was sure about the time or if she might be mistaken. They insisted that Paul was the killer, and only her testimony about the time prevented them from holding Moran accountable. Eventually, the woman assumed that she might have arrived a little later, and that was enough for the police. During the trial, the prosecution attempted to portray Morin as a strange loner whose behavior raised concerns among the other town residents. They also insisted that he had enough time to abduct Christine as her mother arrived home later than she initially stated. Regarding Guy Paul's family members who confirmed his alibi, a psychologist brought in by the prosecution claimed they all showed signs of covering for him. A key moment at the trial was the testimony of an undercover officer who had been placed in Morin's cell while he awaited trial. According to the officer, Morin mentioned specific details about the crime, such as the cause of death. However, this information had been reported in the newspapers, so Morin wasn't revealing anything new. He also said to his cellmate that his favorite movie was The Shining and responded to some of his questions with quotes from the film. Although Morin maintained his innocence, the undercover officer's testimony had a significant impact on the trial. Combined with the prosecution's efforts to portray him as a strange and dangerous individual, it further solidified the negative image of Guy Paul in the eyes of the jury. But despite all of this, the prosecution's evidence was deemed questionable, and ultimately, the jury did not find it sufficient for a conviction. Morin was found not guilty and released from the courtroom. The prosecution immediately announced plans to appeal, insisting that they still believed in Morin's guilt. Christine's family was once again devastated. They faced the reality of living just yards away from the man they believed was responsible for their daughter's murder. Her father added that they had been living in hell since her death, and now that hell would go on. Queensville residents were also unhappy with the verdict. Many people believed Guy Paul was the killer and did not want him living among them. When he returned home, someone repeatedly filled their mailbox with threatening letters, and some people even threw various objects at their house. Meanwhile, the prosecution worked on their appeal. They argued that the judge in the first trial hadn't clearly explained the concept of reasonable doubt to the jury, and that was enough for a higher court to schedule a new trial. It began in 1991, several years after the murder. During the preparations, the public learned a few interesting facts. It was revealed that the expert who matched the fabric fibers from Morin's car to the victim's sweater had worn a sweater of the same color and material during the comparison. However, by the time of the second trial, much of the evidence she worked with had simply disappeared, including the fabric fibers and several hairs found on the victim's body or clothing. But that wasn't all. Several of Christine's bones and a cigarette butt found near her body were also missing. It turned out that this cigarette butt had never been added to the case materials, possibly because Morin never smoked. Despite all these alarming issues, the new trial was on its way. This time, the prosecution's main theory was that Morin saw the recorder in Christine's hands when she came back from school, took out his clarinet, and started playing. Hearing the music, Christine approached his car, and Morin forced her inside, drove her to an unknown location, and killed her. Although this theory was admittedly weak, in July 1992, the jury reached a unanimous decision. They found Guy Paul guilty of murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. But this time, public opinion shifted dramatically. Initially, the media portrayed Morin as a strange and dangerous loner, but after learning about all the investigators' mistakes, the narrative changed completely. The media began to suggest that Morin might be innocent and a victim of sheer incompetence. After the verdict, a group of concerned citizens band together to challenge the court's decision. In light of this pressure, Morin's lawyer filed an appeal for a new trial, and Morin was released from prison on bail. Such a move was quite rare, but the widespread public outcry played a crucial role. But there were significant challenges. The bail was set at around $500,000, forcing Morin's parents to mortgage their home. This was their only option to raise that amount of money. The lawyer requested a DNA analysis of the victim's underwear, which still contained a biological sample. Previous attempts to analyze it had been unsuccessful due to the limited technology of the time. However, by the mid-90s, advances in forensic science allowed experts to extract a DNA profile from the semen found on the fabric. The results conclusively showed that the DNA did not match Guy Paul's. This revelation sparked outrage across Canada. Morin had spent a total of 1.5 years in prison and went through several years of trials, so his life was basically ruined. All of this was due to the actions of police officers who focused on framing him rather than seeking the truth. In January 1995, 10 years after Christine's body was discovered, all charges against Morin were dropped, and he was declared a free man. He later sued the authorities and was awarded $1.2 million. Some investigators who had fabricated evidence against him faced legal consequences or lost their jobs. This case also led to some of the most significant reforms in Canada's legal system aimed at preventing such miscarriages of justice in the future. After Morin's release, authorities decided to reopen the investigation into Christine's murder, forming a new team of detectives. With the DNA sample of the real killer in hand, they focused on collecting samples from anyone who could have potentially committed the crime. They gathered DNA from several hundred men, but there was no match. Since then, the case has seen little progress. It was handed over to the cold case unit, which reviewed it from time to time, but they also couldn't find new suspects. A significant challenge was that the original team of detectives not only lost some evidence, but also failed to conduct a thorough investigation at the time. They were so convinced that Guy Paul was the perpetrator that they didn't even consider other potential suspects. Canadian media continued to cover the case, and after one specific publication in a major news outlet, journalists received several interesting leads. One man claimed his father had confessed to Christine's murder on his deathbed, while others pointed to individuals with questionable reputations who lived in Queensville at the time. The journalists passed all this information to the police, but none of the suspects could be definitively linked to the murder. In 2019, 35 years after the murder, the case was reopened again, this time with a new detective assigned to it. With only the perpetrator's DNA sample in his hands, he decided to try a relatively new method, genetic genealogy. Since there were no laboratories in Canada specializing in such complex and innovative work, the detective had to contact a company in the United States and secure funding from his boss. Eventually, his request was approved and the experts began searching for the criminal's relatives using publicly available DNA databases. They identified several individuals who were distant relatives of the DNA sample's owner, but investigating their family trees could have taken years. The experts then decided to cross-reference information about all these distant relatives, which allowed them to narrow down their search. Ultimately, they concluded that the police would need to examine the family trees of around 400 people to find the DNA sample's owner. With all this data, the detective reached out to a colleague in Canada with extensive experience in DNA analysis. The colleague agreed to assist with the investigation and began reconstructing the family trees of those individuals. He decided not to share any details with the detective to prevent bias or the possibility of misleading him while considering the potential involvement of anyone who might come up as a suspect. The specialist and his colleagues worked on this task for 8 months, methodically studying various family trees until they focused on one in particular. The older one of this tree was a man born in 1804. The experts carefully examined hundreds of his descendants. In October 2020, they identified one specific family and finally narrowed it down to a single name that fit all the criteria of the most likely killer, Calvin Hoover. When they shared this information with the detective, he did not recognize the name. Hoover had not appeared in any case files or in the thousands of leads gathered over 3 decades. The detective began to investigate this individual and soon was met with a shocking surprise. It turned out that Hoover was one of Christine's parents' closest friends. At the time of the murder, Calvin Hoover was 28 years old and lived in Queensville with his wife and children. Christine's parents had been friends with his family for a long time, and Hoover was even listed as their emergency contact. Moreover, just a few days before the tragedy, Christine's mother had visited them. During that visit, she told Hoover's wife that she would be going to see her husband in prison with her son after a dental appointment, but she wouldn't be bringing Christine because she was too young for such a place. This meant that Hoover's wife was aware that Christine would be home alone on a specific day and at a specific time, and Hoover himself, who was also at home, could have overheard this. Christine also knew Hoover well and would have had no hesitation getting into his car or going with him, as he was a close friend of her parents. The detective then wondered why Hoover's name hadn't come up in the case files if he was so close to the family. Upon further investigation, he uncovered another interesting fact. After the body was found, the police had spoken to Hoover's wife, who mentioned that she wasn't at home at the time of Christine's disappearance. However, She added that her husband was at home looking after their small children. Apparently, the police were satisfied with his wife's account and accepted it as an alibi for Hoover without bothering to question the man himself. This meant that Hoover had the opportunity to commit the crime and the detective only needed to confirm his guilt. But there was another big issue. Hoover had died in 2015 after struggling with some serious health problems. The detective, who still needed a direct DNA sample from Hoover, began to consider his options. Cases of such deaths were not always investigated thoroughly, and even if the body had been exhumed, there might not have been any biological samples left after 5 years. However, he got lucky. When he contacted the medical experts who had examined Hoover's body, they informed him that they still had 2 vials of his blood. The samples were promptly sent to the lab, and experts extracted a DNA profile from the blood. When they compared it to the killer's profile, they found a complete match. Hoover was indeed the one who was responsible for Christine's death. Christine's parents were shocked by this news, as they had never suspected that their close friend could be the killer all these years. They were also frustrated that he had lived his life with a family and children without facing any consequences for his actions. Hoover's relatives were also stunned when the police informed them of his involvement in Christine's murder. His wife said she had never even considered that her husband could be connected to the case in any way. Paul Moran told reporters that the discovery of the real killer changed nothing for him. He spent about 10 years between prison and courtrooms, and after all the charges were dropped, many people continued to believe he was the murderer. He added that he lived in constant fear for all those years, a fear that still haunts him to this day. He stated that this case not only destroyed Christine's life, but also his own. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.